A beautiful woman once lived, though only for a short time. She was a remarkable blonde who once took in a young girl left behind by her parents, unaware that the child carried within her the very miracle she had long prayed for. The market buzzed with noise and motion. Livestock brayed and mooed, iron clanged together, and the dry wind stirred up dust that stung the eyes and coated the boots of those who had walked too far. It was autumn in Wyoming, and the cold bite in the wind seemed sharper this year. The chill crept into bones, curling around the edges of coats and crawling down spines. All around, traders bartered with loud voices. Potatoes exchanged for bullets, chickens swapped for firewood. But in a shaded corner of the market, a different transaction was underway. "She's strong enough to sweep or pull weeds." A man slurred, his breath heavy with liquor. "Won't cause trouble unless you let her rest too long. Take her for $2. Or maybe for a sack of oats if you've got 'em." His coat was worn thin, boots torn and split. Next to him, a girl stood quietly, cloaked in a shawl far too big for her frame. Arms crossed tightly across her chest, head bowed low beneath a bonnet hiding her eyes. She looked barely 16. Her hair was matted, tangled. She didn't speak. No pleas, no cries, no glance for help. She simply stared at the ground, hands clenched in the fabric of her dress like it was the last thing anchoring her. The man beside her, her father, by the look of him, gave her a shove forward. "She eats little," he grunted. "Quiet as the grave. Won't give you any grief." A few onlookers chuckled. One elbowed the man next to him and muttered, "That one's broken. No fight left in her." Near the edge of the group, a man named Reed Carson stood watching. He hadn't come for this. He needed nails, maybe salt. But his steps had stilled when he saw the girl standing by the wagon, barely more than a shadow in the afternoon light. At 41, Reed had seen what desperation did to people, during the war and after. His beard was streaked with gray, coat rough but clean, and though he hadn't smiled in years, there was something behind his eyes, something that still recognized the quiet strength in things others discarded. Another man called out an offer, $1.50, and a flask of whiskey. The girl flinched. Her father considered. Then Reed stepped forward. $3, he said flatly. "And you never speak her name again." The man squinted at him. "You buy-in or rescuing, mister? Makes a difference." Reed didn't answer. He pulled the coins from his pocket and dropped them into the man's cracked palm. The clink rang louder than it should have. The man grunted, jerked his head toward the girl, and spat. "She's yours now. Hope she turns out better for you." As quickly as they'd gathered, the small crowd dispersed. No drama, no fight, just the slight, weary slump of the girl's shoulders as she realized she had been passed on once more. Reed turned toward her. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded. "Then come." She hesitated. Her eyes darted from his boots to his face. Reed shrugged off his coat, a faded wool thing patched at the seams, and held it out to her. "You'll freeze halfway up the ridge without it," he said. "Put this on." She reached slowly. Her fingers brushed the inside lining and froze. Then, without a sound, she began to cry. It wasn't loud, not the sort of cry that asked for attention. It was the silent kind, buried deep over the years, crying like someone who forgot how. She clutched the coat to her chest, tears soaking into it. When she looked up, it wasn't hope in her eyes. Not quite, but it wasn't hopeless either. Reed said nothing more. He turned and headed for the wagon. She followed, still holding the coat like it might vanish. They rode northward, away from the market noise, the snickering men, and the father who never once turned to look back. The girl stayed quiet. Reed didn't ask her name. Names had to be earned where he came from. But in his thoughts, he called her the girl from nowhere. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. Something buried long ago in grief and cold earth. He didn't yet know that she carried a secret. He didn't yet know that the life growing inside her was the very answer to prayers whispered by his wife every night until her last breath. But he would come to know. The wagon creaked as it rolled over the frozen path. The trees whispered in the wind, shaking loose icy needles. Reed kept the reins steady, eyes fixed ahead. The girl tucked the coat tighter around herself, still silent. They crossed a small creek, its surface cracked with frost. The mare hesitated. Reed murmured to her, and she stepped forward. The girl stared down at the broken ice as they passed. "Gets colder the higher we go," Reed said after a while. "Wind comes down off the ridge meaner than a hungry wolf." She said nothing. He glanced at her, then added, "You don't have to talk. Not until you want to. I'll call you Kid for now." Still no reply, but her shoulders softened a little. That was enough. By the time they reached the clearing, dusk had settled in. The sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the trees in dark shades. The cabin sat nestled among the aspens and pine. The roof sagged, the porch leaned, but the windows were clean. A place built not for memories, but for survival. For what comes next. Reed stopped the wagon and got down. He offered her his hand. She paused, then took it. Her fingers were cold and thin. He helped her up the steps and opened the door. Warmth spilled out. Pine heat and the dry glow of the cast-iron stove. A fire already burning. The room thrummed with a quiet hum, the scent of ash and dried herbs hanging in the air. The walls stood bare, save for a lone photograph above the hearth. A woman smiling gently. Reed's wife, though no one had spoken her name in years. A girl lingered in the doorway, hesitant. Reed moved past her without a word, slipping off his coat and stepping toward the stove. He scooped soup from a steaming kettle and poured it into a clay bowl, setting it on the table before pulling out a chair. "Sit," he said simply. She obeyed, cautiously, her limbs slow and unsure. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she'd come from or why. Just nudged the bowl in her direction. "Venison and potatoes. Bit plain," he said. "You'll eat better once you learn to cook it yourself." She took the spoon with both hands, trembling a little. As the warm broth touched her tongue, her eyes drifted shut. Reed leaned against the counter, watching her silently. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Without turning, he spoke again. "There's a cot in the back. Blankets clean. Firewood stacked. If you want to wash, I'll heat water." He paused, then added, "And don't worry about being quiet. No one here punishes silence." She froze, spoon halfway to her mouth, eyes locked onto his. He said nothing more, just returned to the stove, stirred the fire, and closed the door behind him. Outside, the trees moaned in the wind. Inside, something subtler stirred. She finished the soup slowly, her gaze eventually rising to the framed photograph. The woman's gentle smile held her attention. She didn't ask who she was. Reed didn't explain. Names she sensed could wait. What mattered was this warmth, a place to sit, a bowl of soup, and a man who didn't demand anything. It wasn't much, but to her it meant everything. And in that silence, something began to shift. Small, fragile, but real. A flicker of warmth strong enough to survive winter. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. The fire crackled. Pine needles rustled against the cabin walls. Reed didn't speak often, and the girl, still nameless to him, didn't seem to mind. She woke early, helped with the chores. Stacking wood, sweeping, fumbling her way through making oats or peeling potatoes. Her first meals were nearly disasters. The cabin often smelled faintly of burnt flour and smoke. But she didn't quit. She wasn't graceful. She spilled water, dropped firewood, burned her knuckles and hid the blisters under her sleeves. But she tried. Reed saw it, in her eyes, in the way her fingers shook with cold or exhaustion. He never scolded her, not even when the fire refused to catch. One morning, he crouched beside her, took up the flint, and gently placed it in her hand. "Strike it like this," he murmured, guiding her fingers across the metal. A spark caught on the moss, blooming into a tiny flame. She watched it like it was magic. Later that week, he brought out the hatchet. "Storm's coming. Need more wood," he said, motioning to the pile outside. She followed. The wind nipped at their skin, but sunlight danced off the snow. Reed showed her how to split kindling, how to brace the wood, where to grip. Her first swing barely made a dent. The second didn't land at all. "Let me help," he said, stepping behind her. His hands came over hers, not to control but to guide. She tensed, unfamiliar with touch that expected nothing in return. But she didn't pull away. Together they brought the hatchet down. The wood split cleanly. She looked up, breath misting in the cold. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, warm, then stepped back, giving her space. It mattered. That evening, as they ate rabbit stew with only a hint of salt, she finally spoke. "My name is Eva." Reed looked up, but stayed silent. "My parents, they kicked me out," she continued, voice tight. "When they found out I was pregnant. Said I'd brought shame." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "They tried to sell me, but no one wants a girl carrying someone else's mistake. Guess they thought silence made me more appealing." She glanced at him, as though waiting for rejection. Reed didn't speak. He set down his spoon, stood, walked to the door, and took his coat. Without a word, he stepped out into the night. Eva sat at the table, heart pounding, hands clenched. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The door opened. Reed came back inside, snow melting from his boots. He walked to the table and placed a cloth sack in front of her. "Rice, lentils," he said. "Enough for 2 till spring." Eva looked at the bag, then at him. He held her gaze, calm, certain. "You're not alone anymore." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. No sobs, no dramatics, just the return of something long forgotten, dignity. Reed gave a quiet nod. "Thank you." He sat back down and picked up his spoon. The fire crackled on. They resumed eating in silence. There was no need for more words. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Winter was settling in quickly, but inside the cabin, for the first time since the girl had arrived, there was something more than just warmth. The fire seemed to welcome them both. It was no longer just Reed's fire, there was space for 2. Winter did not wait. It arrived hard and heavy. The pine trees bowed under the weight of fresh snowfall, and everything outside turned an endless, suffocating white. Every morning, Reed rose before the sun, breaking the ice that formed on the water barrel and dragging firewood to the hearth. Eva moved slower now, her hands instinctively holding her swollen belly. Her strength faded with each passing day, her steps becoming shorter, her breath a little heavier. The silence that had once lived in the cabin gave way to small, meaningful sounds. Water simmering, kindling catching flame. The soft scrape of a spoon stirring breakfast meant for 2. Her pregnancy was no longer something unspoken. The child moved inside her like a whispered promise, and Reed noticed. Though he kept his words to a minimum and his movements calm, his gaze lingered. He found himself watching her. The way she absent-mindedly caressed her belly when she thought no one was looking, how her presence filled the space differently now. And sometimes, as he watched the firelight flicker against the cabin walls, memories crept in. He remembered the night his wife died. The snow had fallen thick that evening too, silent and relentless. They had longed for a child, prayed, written letters to distant doctors, and tried every strange medicine they could find. When she finally conceived, they had dared to dream. But the birth came too soon, and the bleeding never stopped. Her hands, cold and desperate, reached for his as she slipped away. He had buried both mother and child beneath the spruce tree at the edge of the clearing. After that, he vowed to shut the world out, to feel nothing ever again. But now he found himself carving wood again. Not because he needed to, but to occupy restless hands. The block of pine in his grip gradually took the shape of a small doll, a rounded head, notched eyes, tiny folded arms. One morning, Eva found it sitting beside her bowl. She picked it up gently, ran her thumb along the ridges, and glanced at Reed. She gave him a small smile. He said nothing, only nodded and returned to his work outside. Later that week, he repaired the back door of her room, reinforcing the frame with fresh planks and stuffing wool into the cracks. He told her it was to stop the draft. That night, when she touched the wall, it was warm for the first time. One evening, after a long day, Reed sat by the fire with an old wool sweater in his lap. It had belonged to his wife, soft with age, worn from memory. The sleeves were torn and the edges frayed. He threaded a needle and began to stitch. At first his fingers fumbled, but he kept going, reinforcing seams and tightening the cuffs. When it was done, he folded it neatly. The blue wool still held the faintest trace of her scent. That night, when Eva came in from the outhouse, she found the sweater laid gently on her bed. She froze in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. Slowly, she stepped forward, picked it up, and sat down on the edge of the bed. She held the sweater to her chest and buried her face in it. The tears came, not from fear or shame, but from release. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I thought I'd have to give birth out here alone, that no one would care if I lived or died." Reed stood just out of sight in the hallway. He didn't enter, didn't say a word, but he heard everything. Instead of going to her, he turned and added another log to the fire, watching the flames rise higher. In them, he realized that not all promises made in grief were meant to last forever. Snow thickened along the ridgelines, muting sound and softening the world. Eva's belly had grown heavy, her steps even more careful. Reed continued chopping wood each day, building a tall stack to last the coming months. Eva spent her hours knitting tiny socks and blankets from leftover yarn, small hopes crafted by hand. Then, one morning, with frost still clinging to the windows and a gray sky looming overhead, the sound of hooves shattered the calm. Reed was by the fire, sharpening a blade. He paused, set the knife aside, and went to the door. Through the frost-covered glass, he saw a man on horseback entering the clearing. The stranger sat tall in the saddle, his coat too refined for wilderness life, a trimmed hat shadowing his eyes. He dismounted with the swagger of someone used to control and walked confidently to the door. He knocked 3 firm strikes. "You Reed Carson?" he asked as he adjusted his gloves. "Jeremiah Boone. I'm here to speak with the girl." Reed's expression tightened. "What for?" Jeremiah gave a sly smile. "Just checking in. Word is she's been up here. Thought I might have some right to know." "What kind of right?" Reed asked, his voice low. Jeremiah leaned in, his voice oily. "Blood." Before Reed could reply, Eva's voice came from behind him, clear and strong. "I'll speak to him." She stepped out, wrapped in the mended sweater. Her arms folded over her belly. Her movements were slow, but every step was firm. She came to stand beside Reed. Jeremiah's smirk faltered. "Eva, you're looking well." She said nothing. He nodded at her belly. "Heard you were still alive. And expecting. Thought maybe I should, I don't know, do the right thing. Be part of the kids." Her eyes burned with fire. "You saw my father throw me out, and you said nothing," she said, her voice shaking. "You turned away when I needed you." "It wasn't like that," he protested. "It was exactly like that," she snapped back. He raised his hands in a helpless gesture. "I just want to be part of the child's life. He's my son. You don't get to call him that." Eva shot back, eyes flashing. "You gave up that right the day you walked away. You didn't ask if I was okay. You didn't try to help. And now you show up when it's convenient, thinking that's enough." He opened his mouth to reply, but she didn't let him. "You think blood makes someone a father?" she asked, stepping forward, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "This baby, he's more than just flesh and blood. He's the one thing I thought I'd never be allowed to keep." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, his expression hard. "He's still mine." "No," Eva said firmly, her voice rising. "He's not. A real father stays. A real father doesn't run. This child already has a father. Someone who gave us warmth and safety and never asked for anything in return." She turned toward Reed, her voice catching. "My son has a father. And it isn't you." Reed hadn't spoken, but now he stepped up and gently laid his hand on Eva's shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, but it spoke volumes. Jeremiah's face flushed red with anger. For a moment, Reed thought he might lash out. But then Jeremiah turned, fists clenched, and walked silently to his horse. Without a single word or glance back, he rode off. Eva stood still, breathing heavily, one hand resting over the child who shifted gently inside her. Reed didn't say anything, he didn't have to. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, burning strong, and something deeper than flames took hold. A bond that didn't come from blood, but from choice. Later, the fever arrived like a shadow on the wind, slipping through the cracks in the windows and settling deep in Eva's bones. At first, she just moved slower. Her skin lost color, her voice grew faint. But by nightfall, she was shaking, teeth chattering, buried under every quilt Reed could find. He stayed by her side, a bowl of steaming water on the table, a cloth across her brow. The fire roared, but it couldn't chase the cold from her body. Her skin burned with fever and yet felt icy to the touch. Reed recognized it, he'd seen it before. The same sickness that had taken his wife. Not again. He searched through the old cabinet by the hearth, hands trembling as he dug through boxes of dust-covered herbs. At last, he found what he needed: angelica, white pine bark, dried meadow plants. His wife had used them once when sickness crept in. Whispering prayers, she'd stirred the mixture. Reed didn't pray, but he ground the herbs and steeped them in boiling water, then helped Eva drink, his hands careful and tender. "You've got to sweat it out," he murmured, brushing her damp hair from her face. "Just stay with me." All through the night, he kept the fire alive, changed the cloth on her forehead, and held her hand as her breath came in shallow gasps, then slowly steadied. At dawn, the fever finally broke. Eva opened her eyes, blinking into the soft flicker of firelight. "You're still here," she whispered, voice raspy. Reed gave her a small, crooked smile. "Didn't plan on going anywhere." Her lips trembled. "I didn't think someone like me, someone broken and left behind, could be worth this kind of care." Reed looked at her quietly for a long time, then stood and walked to a tall chest across the room. He knelt down, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out a worn leather journal. He handed it to her. "My wife's," he said simply. "She wrote in it most nights. Never let anyone read it. But I think she'd want you to now." Eva opened it slowly. The pages were soft and faded. The ink almost vanished, but the writing was neat and graceful. She read aloud in a whisper. "If I could hold a child of my own, I think I'd cry every day for a year. Not from sadness, but because I'd finally understand what it means to feel full." Tears slid down Eva's cheek as she turned page after page. Each entry held the aching dreams of motherhood. Lullabies, baby shoes, tiny fingers curled in hers on a winter morning. "I didn't know she wanted it so badly," Eva murmured. Reed sat beside her, voice quiet. "She wanted it more than anything. We tried. And when it didn't happen, it hollowed her out. She never blamed me. She just blamed time." Eva placed a gentle hand over her belly, feeling the child stir inside her. Then she carefully rested the journal over her heart. "I never knew my baby would be wanted by someone besides me," she said. "But now I want her name to mean something." She looked at Reed, eyes glistening. "I want to name her after your wife." Reed's breath caught. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he nodded once, firmly, like something long buried had been unearthed. "Her name was Lillian," he said softly. Eva smiled. "Lillian Shilby." In the hush that followed, the cabin seemed to breathe with them. The fire cracked, the wind softened, and in the space between pain and healing, two broken hearts found something whole. Outside, the snow came heavier, blanketing the world in quiet white. Reed kept a shovel by the door, carving paths through drifts taller than his knees. But inside, the house stayed warm. Eva's belly grew full, round as the winter moon. She moved slower now, out of breath more often. Reed noticed her watching the snow with a distant look, part wonder, part fear. She didn't say it aloud, but he understood. He'd seen that same fear in Lillian's eyes near the end. As the days passed, Eva grew more anxious. Reed didn't offer words. He just did what needed doing. He boiled water, dried herbs, prepared cloths. He lined drawers with soft baby blankets. He carved a cradle from pine, etching her favorite flowers along the edges. Every act was quiet and purposeful, as if he were building a sacred space. One evening, Eva stood in the doorway, her hair tangled in the wind, one hand resting against the wall. The snow came nearly to her knees, yet she didn't move, just stared into the white, like it held an answer she hadn't yet dared to ask. "You shouldn't be out here," Reed said softly, approaching her. She turned, eyes gentle but stormy. "I needed the air." She looked down at her belly, then back up at him, voice trembling. "When the baby comes, if I want to leave after, will you stop me?" Her question fell between them like snow, soft but heavy. Reed looked past her, out at the forest bent beneath the weight of winter. Then he stepped closer, hesitantly placing a hand on her swollen belly. The warmth of life beat beneath his fingers. The child moved as if recognizing him. "You don't have to run," he said, his voice raw. "You and this baby. You're the reason I came back to life." Eva blinked, eyes wide and shining, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Toward the grove he walked, the weight of the past heavy in each step. "And when I did, I buried everything else with her," he murmured. Laughter, hope, perhaps even God, had been laid to rest that day. But then his eyes met hers. He remembered the day clearly. Crowded market, a girl treated like a beast of burden. And in her eyes something familiar, something he used to see in his own reflection. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "I didn't save you to be anyone's hero, Eva," he said quietly. "I saved you because I couldn't keep going through life like a ghost." Tears shimmered in Eva's eyes, though she didn't look away. He gently placed a hand over her stomach. "This baby," he whispered, "isn't a burden. She's not a mistake. She's our second chance." He took a step back, giving her space, breathing room. "If you still want to leave after she's born, I won't stop you," he said. "But I want you to know, this is your home now. You have a family. No one's going to drive you out ever again." She looked at him with a new kind of strength blooming in her gaze, something sturdier than fear. It was trust. She stepped closer and rested her forehead against his chest. "No one's ever said that to me before," she whispered. "Not when they called me trouble. Not when they sold me. Not when they left." Reed wrapped his arms around her gently, holding her as though she might shatter. "You're not trouble," he murmured. "You're a blessing. Both of you." Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, but inside the cabin, everything held still, suspended in that sacred quiet between a storm and a new beginning. In that pause between grief and healing, two souls stood in the doorway of something neither dared hope for, and the life inside Eva stirred again, waiting, alive. When the storm came, it came without kindness. Wind tore across the mountains, hurling snow and ice at the cabin like clenched fists. The fire roared inside, shadows leaping across the walls as Reed worked swiftly, feeding the flames, heating water, laying clean cloths on the table. Eva's cries sliced through the room, fierce and raw. She lay on the cot, drenched in sweat, hands white-knuckled around the blanket as pain racked her body. Reed knelt beside her, heart pounding harder than in any battle. He had watched death take his wife once, helpless, unable to stop it. But not this time. This time he would fight. "You're doing fine," he said, though his voice trembled. "You're strong, Eva. You can do this." "I can't," she sobbed through clenched teeth. "Yes, you can," he whispered, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're not alone." The hours dragged on. The storm screamed. Reed boiled more water, whispered every word of comfort he could muster, held her close when fear gripped her. He had no training, no real idea what to do, but he gave all he had, his hands, his voice, his heart. And just before dawn, a new sound rose above the storm, a small, sharp cry. Eva collapsed onto the pillows, crying now not from pain, but from joy. Reed cradled the tiny baby, wrapped her carefully, and looked down at the miracle in his arms. She was red-faced, loud, full of life. Tears fell down his cheeks before he even noticed them. Eva looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "She's here because of you," she said. "Because you stayed." He knelt beside her, ready to hand over the child, but Eva shook her head gently. "No," she said. "She's yours too." She placed the baby back into his arms, watching as he held the little girl like a man cradling redemption. And in that moment, years of grief loosened their grip. A man who had buried hope in the snow now held it warm and breathing against his chest. That year, spring arrived late. But arrive it did. The snow melted, uncovering patches of green. Birds returned to the trees. Pines lifted their limbs toward the sun once more. Inside the cabin, everything had changed. At the table near the window sat 3 figures. Eva, glowing with quiet strength. Reed, older, softened by happiness. And between them, their daughter Lillian, eyes wide with wonder, fingers wrapped tightly around her father's thumb like it was the only solid thing in her world. Evenings were filled with meals, stories, and the kind of silence that felt peaceful, not empty. Mornings began with birdsong and the gurgling laughter of a child discovering language. They weren't tied together by blood, but by something even deeper. 5 years later, Willow Creek celebrated its spring festival under blooming trees. Children played, couples danced, and neighbors caught up with each other. Among the crowd walked a small family: Reed Carson, Eva Carson, and their daughter, Hope. Hope wore a yellow dress with ribbons in her braids, squealing with delight at everything: flowers, sweets, even a goat in a hat. Reed lifted her up onto his shoulders like he'd done 100 times, kissed her forehead, and moved with ease through the crowd. 2 older women sitting on a bench watched them pass. "Isn't that the girl from years ago?" one whispered. "The one they said was sold?" The other woman shook her head. "No," she replied firmly. "That's Eva Carson, his wife, and their daughter, Hope." Later that summer, Reed and Eva opened a small school in the church for children without families. They used the same table where Reed once prepared medicines. Hope sat on his lap, proudly reciting her letters as other children listened in awe. She never hesitated to call him Pa, never asked whether she was truly his. She simply knew. And years after that, the same little girl, now grown, picked up a pen. She began to write, her words quiet but strong. "I don't share his blood. I wasn't born with his name. But from his hands I learned kindness. From his eyes I found courage. And from his silences I discovered how to hear love. He is my father. My mother is my miracle. And I am living proof that something beautiful can grow from what the world tried to destroy." Hope Carson closed her journal and looked out across the land her parents had poured their hearts into. And she smiled, because now she knew love didn't need a bloodline. It needed only to be chosen. And they had chosen each other every day. In a place once shaped by sorrow and storms, one man's quiet act of compassion and one girl's refusal to give up had created a family. Not by fate, but by love. A family no one expected, yet one that endured. Unbreakable, unforgettable, born not from what was lost, but from what was found.